As you all probably come back from lunch and have a little bit of a food coma, I wanted to re-engage your brains a little bit with some highly complicated math. So as soon as you know the answer to the following problem, please feel free to yell it out as loud as you like. I want the people next door to hear. This is hard. 12 minus 5. That's kind of pitiful, but a few people got 7, all right, so that's good. So we'll step it up a little bit. Feel free to jump in here. And this one, I need you to answer in the proper format. So we have 3 dots minus 1 dot equals 2 dots. Very good. So people are awake. I like this. So bonus round. Answer in the correct format. We have Roman numeral 4 minus Roman numeral 4 equals 0, not, null, nothing. This seems like a simple concept, right? You either have something or you don't. Something is there or it's not. But obviously I've misled you a bit here because there is no Roman numeral for 0. At a purely philosophical level, this is an unsolvable problem. And the greatest minds in history have been unable to resolve it because they couldn't agree on what nothing actually was. If you take everything out of a box, you're left with a void. And that void is theoretically something. It has a name. It conceptually exists. And in this way, nothing has become a thing. And this idea of nothing as something is exactly what the Greek and Roman philosophers debated about endlessly. Because if nothing is something, then it can be used as a tool. And that's exactly what we do. Design is about simplicity. It's about reduction and clarity. It's about the importance of nothing. So nothing is a tool that we use perhaps unconsciously all the time. But if we could apply it purposefully, then it stands to reason that we could make our maps and our games better. And as technology improves, we have the ability to add more and more to our games, to make them indistinguishable from reality by highlighting every crack, every pore on the face, every strand of hair, every piece of geometry. But we often forget to pause and consider the advantages inherent to the simplicity and clarity of nothing. And a few months ago, as we were sitting around the office, we had this discussion about level clarity, and it kind of inspired me to go back and revisit some of the basic design principles, to take some lessons from the past and see how we might carry them forward into the future. Now, at Epic, we've been fortunate enough to have had some successful games. And within those games, there's one map that really stands out as what is quite possibly our most popular map of all time, and that is Facing Worlds. Now, Facing Worlds, or just CTF Face as it's commonly known, was a masterpiece of simplicity. It stands out to me as representative of a generation of design techniques that we're kind of starting to stray from. It has a really clean use of space, visual clarity, and flow, and it's all due in large part to its great use of applied nothingness by way of negative space. Now, the popularity of Facing Worlds is impressive and humbling, really. If you Google Facing Worlds, you'll get over 37 million hits. And I've seen copies, remakes, refactors, maps inspired by Face by the hundreds, if not the thousands. You'll see homebrew versions popping up in Worms, of all places, Halo, StarCraft, Castle Wolfenstein, TF2, Minecraft, any number of games that allow their players to mod and create. As recently as last year, PC Gamer did a feature on the map calling it one of the best multiplayer maps ever. Just this one fan page that I found randomly on the internet has over 24 versions available for download. I wonder how many of them were able to recapture that same simplicity and beauty. How many of them tried to update the map without really realizing what made it work in the first place? Because this is something that even we have struggled with in our own internal versions and official updates. Face has been represented in multiple generations of Epic's games across multiple versions of the Unreal Engine. So we can track how those techniques changed and get a clear understanding of the impact that that had on the history of the map as it evolved. So what did make it work? To a large degree, I'm saying it was negative space. Now, technically speaking, negative space is the space where things aren't present, or the space between objects. And negative space has been used for millennia It's found both in Aboriginal and Paleolithic cave art. In the modern sense, you see it being used as a means of intentionally focusing the eye and achieving compositional balance. You see it everywhere, even today, although you may not realize what you're seeing, and quite honestly, that's kind of the point. Have you ever noticed that there's a delivery arrow between the E and the X in the middle of the FedEx logo? Or NBC's peacock? That the World Wildlife Federation's panda is actually just a collection of shapes. It's not actually an animal. That there's no S in the USA Network's logo. Disney has even come out with kid-friendly pirate skull t-shirts that don't have scary skulls on them. In all of these cases, your brain fills in the missing details for you. Now, another common definition of negative space is just removing miscellaneous detail to achieve a natural balance that allows your eye to understand and appreciate the focus of what it's looking at. So combining these various techniques, we see negative space being used in game marketing all the time. Battlefield, League of Legends, Halo, Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed. We used it to give Marcus his flaming phoenix wings in Gears of War. It was the basis for our entire launch campaign in Gears of War 2, and it serves as the foundation for each and every one of our iconic Crimson Omen logos. So it's somewhat ubiquitous in 2D space, but what about 3D? Well, design can be defined as a noun. It's a plan or a draft. But it's also a verb, to plan, to project, or to intend. And I love that intent definition because it really helps capture how much of design is about emotion and empathy. And to me, this is one of the core concepts of what I'm calling negative space design, and using these techniques to achieve the more commonly discussed principles of design, which are balance, contrast, and emphasis. Now, these are all concepts that we used to keep in mind whenever we built anything. We started with a void of nothing that, ironically, was actually conceptually something because the Unreal Engine was subtractive, and we had to carve out space into the world from this void. And as we subtracted space into this void, every polygon was significant. You had to balance every cut, every shape, and purposefully create architecture that emphasized our designs in as simple a manner as possible, because technology at the time wasn't really capable of more. And getting this right was as much of an art as it was a science, and the best designers understood this, and you could clearly see it in their work. This is one of the reasons that I fell in love with CTF Face, and why I've always respected Cedric, who I don't know if he's here. That would be awesome if he was. Sadly not. He is the map's original designer. And I've always thought he was one of the industry's best, a real master at his craft. And masters have always been those people who understand the relationship between art and science. Look at Leonardo da Vinci, considered to be one of the greatest minds in history. Painter, sculptor, mathematician, engineer, politician, anatomist, geologist, botanist, true crossover between art and science. Now, da Vinci expanded on the concept of negative space with something that he called sfumato. It was a technique which includes the concept of using the surrounding space to imply meaning. Now, there's more to sfumato than just this basic concept, but Mona Lisa is a great example of what I'm talking about here. Focus on her head for a minute. It wasn't stenciled out with hard lines and then colored in like you would a coloring book. Instead, the shape of her features are actually defined by the dark spaces of hair and shadow, which also serves to highlight her face as a focal point in the image. Now, this is the opposite of a silhouette, and it's a common technique we use in video games to lure players toward an exit or an important item. So in a broader sense, using negative space can be defined as using what isn't there. And this is a definition which has wide application to 3D space, and by extension, to both game design and level design. If you look at famous structures like the Pantheon or the Eiffel Tower, their use of shapes and negative space imparts a visual clarity that gives the eye a focal point and a really easy way to understand the space around them, the space that surrounds and defines them. And it's no coincidence that if you take these two images and stack them, you begin to see the basic framework for the towers and facing worlds. The use of negative space in the original Facing Worlds map intentionally gave the player that visual clarity that meant more focus on the gameplay and less focus on trying to figure out the scene. The simple, well-defined shapes stand out from the background, and the tall, narrowing towers anchor the eye to the important gameplay spaces, and the players in those spaces can be picked out against their dark backgrounds, highlighted sfumato like Mona Lisa's face. Now, of course, this is by no means unique to Facing Worlds. I would actually argue that all of the most popular maps across a wide spectrum of games represent prime examples of good negative space use. You can see those same principles at work in Call of Duty on Crossfire, Counter-Strike in Dust, Halo in Blood Gulch, Quake 3's Longest Yard, League of Legends Summoner's Rift, the list goes on and on. Each of these maps is arguably the most popular map in their respective game. And subconsciously or otherwise, each of them is enhanced by the use of negative space to define their visuals and their gameplay. So before I get too deep on the use of negative space, I think it's important to understand why it works. And the easiest explanation is just biology. Our brains are hardwired to understand these kind of concepts. There are some cultures in the Amazon today who really only use 3 numbers. A few more, and many. Anything beyond that is considered just to be too troublesome. It's not worth the complication. Now, that's not to say that they don't understand what nothing is. It's actually quite the contrary. They think that the concept of nothing is so simple and so universal, it's just not even worth talking about. They would consider the debates of the Greek and Roman philosophers as just wasting time on the obvious. Alex was a famous African gray parrot, and he was known for his cognitive abilities. He could communicate shapes, sizes, materials, colors, any number of concepts, and not just rote memorization. He understood that 6 things was more than 3 things. He could even combine concepts to create words for things that he hadn't been taught. And so when the researchers started teaching him to count, he astounded the staff by not only understanding, but being able, or not only communicating, but being able to understand the concept of nothing without anyone ever teaching it to him. This is part of our biology. This is the way your brain works. And this inherent understanding of nothing is one of the most powerful tools that we can use to improve the overall experience of our players. You can even see how the opposite of negative space has a dramatic effect on level clarity. If you look at Call of Duty's favela maps, there's so many paths, so much detail, so much going on that it's just visually overwhelming. There's nowhere for your eye to stop and make sense of the scene. Now, Gestalt theory tells us how the brain processes information by breaking it down or combining groups of details into larger chunks that are easier to process. Visual information in particular is processed all at once, compared to words and numbers, which are processed sequentially. Now, artists take advantage of this technique all the time. Look up just about any speed painting video, and you'll notice that the artists flip their images back and forth, and then they'll suddenly zoom in and zoom out. And they do this so that they don't get lost in the details. They do it so they can take in the entire image all at once and see how the piece reads or communicates as a whole. And the video I'm referencing here is just a random one I pulled off the internet. And you can see that just in the space of a second or two, the artist moves from painting the fine details in a large image to glancing at the entire image all at once and zooming in and out. It's just a blip, but that's all it takes because of the way our brains process visual information in a quick flash all at once. Now, of course, this isn't a new technique. It wasn't invented by Photoshop users. And the lo-fi version, which has been used for centuries, is the squint test. Here's a famous negative space image of a dog. If you have trouble seeing, squint, and the dog will probably come into focus. Squinting gives you the broad sense of a scene while minimizing the impact of the finer details. This is kind of like an auto-gestalt simulator. Now, to account for this, we actually implemented a squint tool in Unreal Engine 3. I don't know exactly who did it. I tried to figure it out, and I couldn't. It got a wild goose chase. But I had this image in my head of a programmer walking into a room full of artists, and they're all squinting at their scenes and complaining of headaches. So essentially, with a click of this button, you could blur the frame buffer, making the scene in your editor viewport look just as it would as if you were squinting, but with less eye strain. And since I didn't have everything I wanted to show you today running in Unreal Engine 3, I tried to recreate that same squint effect using Photoshop's built-in blur filter. So here's Face and Favela side by side, and here they are with Photoshop's default blur filter to show you what each scene might look like if you were using that squint tool. Now, if you can imagine yourself moving through these maps in real time, your eyes quickly scanning for enemies, these blurry images are similar to what your brain would process in a split second. And even without stopping to focus on any particular detail, you can see that Face is still almost completely readable. The paths are there, the doors, the architecture, the shapes. It would be really simple for your brain to take this entire scene in quickly and make decisions quickly in game. Now, by contrast, Favela has just become a jumble of bleeding colors. And the only real distinct feature there is the sky. Your brain has to struggle a little bit to interpret the individual details. And even though that might happen in a split second, that's all it takes to affect your reaction time in combat. It slows down that decision-making process because you have to mentally focus and process each detail sequentially rather than taking in the scene as a whole. So squinting, shrinking, blurring, these are all really simple techniques that you can use almost at any time to ensure that your foreground and your background work together. The foreground and the background, if the foreground and the background are fighting for attention, then neither's going to win. Good use of negative space, however, can focus the player's attention on what you think are the important elements of your scene, meaning that you take an active part in the design process, that you can actually influence the experience of your players. Another way the brain works through a complicated scene is to break it down into what cognitive scientists call small, meaningful patterns. We take groups of objects that are similar and we quickly combine them into a single chunk that's easy to process. Now, I wanted to visualize this process too, so leaning on Photoshop one more time, I used the palette knife filter. And the palette knife processes an image, taking areas of similar color and combining them into one of the same color, just like our brains might do with visual information. So again, here's Face and Favela, and here they are processed with Photoshop's default settings on the palette knife filter. You can see that all the main features of Face are still there. The paths, the doors, the assault points, everything comes through clearly, but by contrast, Favela becomes an obscure collection of blotches. You can't even distinguish the gameplay space from the architecture anymore. Now, this is significant because it says how affects perception in our maps. An image with well-defined borders is really easy for our brains to process. The first two circles here have nice, clean borders, while the last circle is fuzzy, and it's more difficult to find the edges. When you look at an image, the main focal point is called the figure, and it's processed very quickly and easily when it's well differentiated from the background or negative space of the scene known as the ground. If your players can't discern figure from ground, they'll have difficulty understanding how to navigate, and they'll struggle with target identification. And that's the basis for the classic image you see here, where ambiguity causes the brain to question whether it's looking at a candlestick or two faces. Each of you will make that decision very quickly, and somewhat ambiguously because there is no right answer. In a split second, you'll decide whether you're looking at a candlestick or faces. But in a video game, that same split second can be an eternity. It can cost you life. It can throw an important play that ends the match. And the ambiguity of that decision means that your player isn't necessarily experiencing the design that you intended. Communicating clarity is a fundamental part of your role as a level designer. Now, I've heard, I don't know for sure, but I have heard that Favela was the #1 drop point in Call of Duty's campaign, and that their multiplayer version was actually one of their least popular maps. Now, obviously, that feeling of overwhelming oppression and the frantic nature of combat was the whole point of that mission. And given the source material that they had to work with, they actually did a pretty fantastic job of distilling it down to a gameplay experience. I'm simply pointing out that there's a stark contrast that can be achieved if you focus on the use of negative space as a tool while you're designing. Nor am I claiming that I myself have been immune to these problems. We all struggle with it, and that's exactly why I wanted to talk about it today. In Gears of War, we had a map called Gridlock that was probably our most popular map in the franchise. And not surprisingly, the map has a pretty good use of negative space with the shapes and the buildings contrasting with the different colors in the stone and against the background of the sky. Now, applying those same filters as before, the blur and the palette, you can see how the map's features still hold up. The cars are still distinct from the ground that they're sitting on. That gameplay space stands out from the buildings, and there's a nice contrast against the background of the sky. Now, with Gears of War 2, we wanted to bring Gridlock back with an updated version that aged the environment to match the progression of the game's story. So we set out to do a theme that was overgrown. And in so doing, I think we actually lost a lot of that great contrast. So here's side by side of the same exact position in Gears 1 and Gears 2. And applying those same filters, you can see that even though Gears 2 has a high contrast sky to outline the shapes on the horizon, the overall sense of negative space is completely lost along the floor. There's no figure ground distinction. And important areas like hay, where the gameplay takes place, are just visually muddy. And while admittedly there are any number of other factors going on here, here's a chart that shows map popularity in Gears of War 2 is a factor of time played, and you'll notice that the new version of Gridlock is at the very bottom of the list. So with Gears of War 3, we made this awesome decision to age the map even further. And this time the gameplay space became so overgrown that the gameplay completely fell apart. What was once the most popular map in the game became that one map that our testers hated playing. We hadn't changed the physical play space, the weapon loadout, or even the collision. But just that shift in tone and color meant to a change in perception, a perception of negative space that took away the clarity that we had gotten from that original version of the map. So we saw that this just wasn't working, and near the end of the project, we threw everything away. And we went back to a cleaner style that brought back the contrast we were aiming for and highlighted the negative space aspects of the map. Not to belabor the point, but here's a screenshot of the map, blurred again with the other filter. The cars stand out from the ground, the gameplay spaces differentiated from the buildings. The whole scene has a nice contrast against the background. And sure enough, here's a chart showing this version of Gridlock back in the top 3 most played maps of Gears of War 3's lifetime. Application of negative space design techniques led to an increase in map readability and, by extension, playability and enjoyability. So even though it was difficult to do at the time, I'm really glad that we made that call to throw everything away and change the map. And that chart tells me that the payoff was worth the effort. And we might not have actually been brave enough to do that had we not already struggled with this problem in another map. And ironically, that map was CTF Face. With the sequel to UT in Unreal Tournament 2003, we transitioned to a new version of the Unreal Engine, and we decided to update Facing Worlds along with it and take advantage of our new Egyptian setting. Now, the Egyptian concept for Zero is the Nefer. It's a hieroglyph which roughly translates to the beginning of everything. It's a visual representation of the heart. Now, to the ancient Egyptians, then, you could say that the zero, or nothing, is the heart of everything. And I mark it as no coincidence that the same hieroglyph is also used to mean beautiful. Design is about beauty and simplicity and the importance of nothing. Sadly, I don't think any of that actually translated into UT 2003's version of Facing Worlds. If you look at side-by-side comparisons of the two versions of the map, you can definitely see the similarities in shape. But there are big differences in clarity. The original Facing Worlds map had 540 actors in the entirety of the map. The new version had over 4,000. The original Facing Worlds had 130 polygons in view from the sniping towers. This new Egyptian version had over 60,000 triangles in view from that same position. It's a 280 times increase in detail, which is quite significant, even broken down into meaningful patterns. So whenever you're building something, it's important to note how your layout will affect the player's gameplay experience. You may have heard of the principle of least effort, which tells us to minimize cognitive load. If you overwhelm your players with too much information, they're likely to struggle with processing it. And note that I'm talking about layout here. I'm not saying that the original Facing Worlds was a better map because it had less detail. You can and absolutely should add more detail to your maps as technology goes on, and I'll speak more on that in a bit. But in this particular instance, I'm specifically referencing the way that those details were implemented. The pyramid blocked lines of sight. The trees pulled our eyes away from the gameplay space, and the rolling terrain was dotted with these pools of water that got in the way of navigation, both visually as well as physically. Decorative pieces were used to separate combat areas, and it transferred these open spaces into really small combat closets. And because of the way our brains process visual information, all of these separate elements actually combined to break up the level in undesirable ways. At Epic, we often talk about removing clutter from our maps. And what we're really trying to say is that we need a better use of negative space. Ask, where are your players' eyes going? Not always, but generally speaking, you want their eyes focused on the gameplay rather than the architecture. So rather than adding detail to an area to make it more beautiful, ask what you can remove. Is the extra geometry actually visually distracting? Are those new pools of water impeding navigation? Can you remove lights or highlight key areas with a sfumato-like effect? Maybe you can replace additional detail with just a simple shift in light or color. As a level designer, your goal should be to simplify and clarify. Streamline the experience and distill it down to those core important elements of gameplay. And remember my favela example from earlier. Geometric color, excessive polygons, can be just as troublesome as visual clutter, distracting shapes and rainbow colors. These two images each have a color histogram in the top right corner. And in the original face, you can see that color is distributed all across the histogram in high, mid, and low range values. And note that there's a single color spike on the low end, and that's indicative of one area filled with of one color, which is the dark skybox. And that's important because it means there's a large area filled by a single color that's going to give you good figure ground contrast. Now, by comparison, look at the UT 2003 version, and there's just a massive bulge along the center of the histogram with no representation in the high or low ranges. And this indicates high midtone values, meaning that the color is going to be fairly uniform across the board. You're not going to get any great visual contrast. And we need that contrast because when objects look similar, our brains will process them as a single related group. And you can simulate that contrast by actually compressing the color in the histograms. And if you do that, the Egyptian version becomes, not surprisingly, this flat white sheet, while the original Facing Worlds becomes this really great example of figure ground reversal, with all the negative spaces of the gameplay areas clearly delineated from the rest of the map. And I'm being generous here by including the moon in the background. That moon actually rotates out of view naturally as the skybox moves during gameplay. And if you remove that moon from the image, you get this perfect negative space outline of the level geometry. The clarity in this view is something that you would never get in that Egyptian version, where everything is just a wash of sameness that causes our brains to spend that extra time processing everything sequentially, detail by detail. And a simple trick as easy as squinting could have identified this problem quickly. Now, that pyramid contributes to the problems because of its color similarity to the rocks and the sand and the towers, and it's all the same. But it also blocks the dark balconies and doorways of the tower. All of the contrast in this scene is actually hidden behind the pyramid. And what's worse, this scene is full of all these upward pointing shapes that drag your eye up into the sky instead of down to where the gameplay is taking place. And this is exactly the opposite of the favela problem, which had too many competing shapes and colors, where Face's lack of variation still has a similar outcome for the player. There's nowhere for your brain to focus. There's no balance to this scene. Now, without anywhere to focus, your brain either takes too much time trying to discern detail, or it tries to take everything all at once, and it skips over details and possibly throwing away important gameplay elements. Take, for example, this shot of an enemy sitting in the sniping perch. Now, that first image on the left, if you'll recall, was the original face where I mentioned this Fumato character outline. Compare it against that same location in the new Egyptian version, and you might not even see the character there at all. Even zoomed in and centered and focused with the sniper scope, that character is barely visible. If you squint, he disappears. There's no contrast. There's no figure ground or front ground differential. There's no negative space to help define his shape or establish a focal point for your eyes. And that same problem is evident all over the map, not just in the main towers. This is the flag room. Squint and look at it. Can you tell me where the flag is in this scene? It's not too hard, but how about the enemy who's guarding it? Neither stands out from their background. Both are nearly invisible. And keep in mind that from a gameplay perspective, these are the two most important things your players should be able to see right now. Can I get a show of hands for anybody who can see both? There's actually a few people. I'm impressed. Try to imagine locating these two things in the heat of the moment while you have this guy aiming and sniping straight at your head. Can anybody not see them even when they're circled? Yeah, that's what I thought. So now do the same thing in this shot from the original map. This one I've intentionally blurred, and you can almost instantly pick out all the important aspects of the scene. You can see the flag, you can see the enemy, you can even see the rocket launcher sitting there on the left-hand side. The original face had a great use of shape, contrast, light, color, and space. UT 2003's version of face had no negative space, no sfumato, and really poor gameplay as a result. And again, these are really simple issues to address if you make the conscious decision to look for them. Look at the Egyptian version of face one last time. With 1 minute of effort, by lowering those clouds a bit, slightly reducing the scale of the central pyramid, you can enhance the readability of the map. There's a nice shadow there now where the pyramid breaks up that central space to add some contrast. The shapes of the tower stand out a bit more because you can see some definition from the structures and the architecture. The dark sky contrasts much better with the paths on the ground. I could have gone on further by actually darkening the tower entrances and removing some of those trees, but this was literally less than 1 minute worth of effort. As it shipped, however, poor use of negative space led to difficulties with navigation and object identification, ensuring that this was never a popular map for us online. So from Egypt, we move forward into Babylonia at a time when the zero was first introduced as a placeholder. And this was utterly confusing because the Babylonian zero was contextual. It could either be 60 or 1/60th. Context, as they say, is everything. So when Unreal Tournament 2004 included a map called Facing Worlds Classic, it stripped away all that unnecessary Egyptian detail. But it was still only a partial success because it was built in the context of the same UT 2003 game systems. This was a more popular version of the map, and there was kind of this collective sigh of relief from the community and, quite honestly, from the people internally at Epic when it was released, because it looked like Face again. It had the same architecture, it had that same setting, but the gameplay was always just slightly off, and it never really captured that feel of the original. As an example of why, I want to go back again to the original Facing Worlds map. And this top-down view highlights the path network that was used by the AI. If you start at the center of the map and work your way toward a tower, you can get there in as little as 4 branch points. And there's only 59 navigation points in the entirety of the map. Now compare that against the Egyptian version, where the navigation network is suddenly highly complicated. To get from the center to a tower here, the minimum number of branch points I could find is over a dozen. And there's 806 navigation points, more than 13 times in the original. Now, I don't want to get too abstract on the theory of negative space and how that translates to simplicity in larger game systems, but you can certainly see the impact that a complicated navigation network would have on AI. And the point that I'm trying to get across is that an AI network serves as an indicator of potential player behaviors. Clearly, a player trying to cross the same map has more choices to make, more obstacles, and more potential points for contention or confusion. The open negative spaces of the gameplay area have been broken up into these smaller collections of small areas. And just as our brain can get overloaded with visual information, it also gets bogged down while attempting to evaluate the differences between too many similar choices. Now, obviously we want to give our players interesting choices and encourage emerging gameplay, but simply adding more isn't better. Gestalt research tells us that too much choice can actually lead to sensory overload. And this is a hot button issue in autism research, where the belief is currently that autistic patients are unable to filter stimuli. They take in every detail of the world, every little bit all around them all the time. And the constant flow of information overwhelms them. And what does this have to do with face and level design? Well, because our brains naturally combine details and establish patterns, more information means more detail that's potentially lost when things get combined. And the results from this perception study describe how much information was lost at different levels of visual threshold. Now, it's important to my point, the slide itself is visually overwhelming and difficult to read, but the quick takeaway here is that as you increase visual information, your brain will actually comprehend less, despite taking longer trying to process it. This is why balance and simplicity and flow are the founding principles of design. So, back to Facing Worlds Classic in UT 2004. Geometric shapes have been simplified, contrast has been enhanced, and the distracting visual elements have been stripped away. But it inherited that same complex navigation network from the Egyptian version. This means Face Classic also inherited the same imbalances and poor flow as seen in the Egyptian version. Unreal Tournament 2004 was an update to the engine rather than a whole new engine, so the Egyptian and classic versions were built in the context of the same game systems. To complicate things even further, here's the original Facing Worlds map in 1-to-1 scale relation to the classic version. The new version is actually 3 times the size of the original version, another problem it inherited from the previous game. Because when we moved into transition into the new Unreal Engine 2, we had all these powerful shaders that we could do flashing lights and cracks in walls, so sure, why not? We did it. And we had the ability to add all these new geometry and now these new polygons, so hey, we did that too. And since we needed more room to fit in all this new stuff, we just made our environments bigger. Note that we didn't necessarily increase the size of our players, only the scale of the environments. And the obvious result of that decision was that individual players and important gameplay elements became more difficult to identify. So, how many of you can find a player in this screenshot? Can I get a show of hands? Almost everyone, that's awesome. How many people can see 2, if you can keep your hands up? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. There are 13 different players on screen in this version. Seeing those teeny tiny players dwarfed in this massive environment is completely overwhelming. The scale of the environment means an increase in visual stimuli, and that perceived increase in complexity can overwhelm the brain as much as actual choice. In fact, perceived complexity has been shown to be more significant than actual complexity. It's that old adage of seeing is believing, and in this case, it is very, very true. So, what the brain perceives is largely based on the amount of stuff or noise that's in the periphery. And more stuff means more time to process and more distraction. In these images here, you'll notice the long bar, the red line, and the shaded box almost instantly because they stand out. You can focus on them easily because there's less complexity around them. There's more negative space. Now, the same holds true for these 2 rows of red dots, and the 2 rows of blue squares, and even the separated colors of mixed dots and squares. But in this last image, despite being the same shapes and the very same colors, it has this chaotic, disorganized mix that's harder to focus on and interpret quickly. So even though UT 2004's version of Face had simplified shapes and good front-ground contrast, it still had 30,000 triangles in view from the towers, more than 200 times the amount of visual information from the original, but no way to focus on any of it. There's a minimum of 12 branch points between the center of the map and the tower entrances, 3 times the number of navigation touch points, and that doesn't count pickups, of which there are twice as many compared to the original. Design principles tell us that in order to increase your players' capability for decision-making and problem-solving, to improve gameplay in your maps, you need to minimize memory load so your players can comprehend their environment. You need to reduce attention switching to keep them focused. And you need to minimize the number of inferences that they need to make by making the scene quickly and easily understandable. The massive amount of information and overwhelming scale of Face Classic led players to perceive the environment as a complicated web, exactly mirroring the visualization of that AI network. And important details, like players, tended to be lost and overlooked. Interestingly, Face Classic was also the first time that we had ever incorporated ambient audio into one of our face maps. And I have no idea why, but we also made this awesome decision to add a driving rock guitar soundtrack. This is a huge departure from the ambient void that was in all the previous versions. And again, I don't want to get too abstract on the meanings of negative space, but obviously you can see how heavy guitar music and crackling flames and all this ambient stuff would compare to the void of negative ambient space in all the other versions. Simply stripping away detail wasn't enough. There was no sfumato here. You can't create the outline of a level and then fill it in like a coloring book. These design choices need to be made in the context of the game with an understanding that the systems define the level. So even though it was labeled as classic, it was mired in the problems of complicated game systems. Facing Worlds Classic was unable to escape the effects of context. Now finally, we have nothing. Zero moved from Egypt to India, and it was the first time that zero actually meant nothing. And that concept was so revolutionary that it spread across the world, through Arabia, Europe, and into China. And in Asia, we see the first representation of zero as a circle, that now familiar zero shape. So with our last and latest version of Facing Worlds, we too went full circle, back to the very roots of the map's design, while also making a generational leap forward into Unreal Engine 3. We adopted a very distinct Asian theme, and we were very careful not to lose those important aspects of gameplay and negative space that helped make the original Facing Worlds map so popular. We started with the context of the original tournament gameplay's map, their systems and geometry, and we used that as a framework upon which we would build the new map's shape, scale, and structure. And this is where I get back to our earlier discussion of what I called clutter. The original Facing Worlds had 130 polygons. The UT 2003 version had over 60,000, which I said was a 280 times increase in detail. This new version of UT 2003 has over 610,000 polygons in view from the towers. That's 4,700 times the original map. As technology improves, we absolutely can add more detail to our maps as long as it's done in the right way. You have to embrace that underlying principle of Gestalt that tells us that the whole is different from the sum of its parts. With blur in place, you can see how the extra geometry of the UT3 map still provides a readable contrast of playable versus non-playable space, meaning less information is lost. If we use the palette filter, you can see how important pieces of gameplay still stand out, with the sniper perches, the central paths, and the tower entrances nicely visible, just as in the original version of the map. Histogram values show a nice distribution in the RGB curves, aligned with spikes on either end, just like the original version, and compressing the histogram highlights good front ground delineation we need for the negative space areas of gameplay to be immediately readable by players, just as in the original version. If you highlight the path network, you can see the simplicity in the system that highlights the clarity of routes and options, only 144 nav points, 5 branches between tower and center of map. And we even went so far as to recreate the original kind of soothing drum and bass music of the original Face, removing all those distracting guitars and highlighting the negative aural space. Now, while I don't have any nicely defined metrics to show map popularity, sadly we didn't have them at the time, I can generate some anecdotal evidence to show that this map was a success. It was well accepted, with several servers popping up that just ran this map 24 hours a day over and over, and even 6 years later, it's not uncommon to see those face-only servers still in heavy rotation. I can't find a single negative thread in the game's official forums, and if you're at all familiar with forums, that in itself is a complete miracle. In fact, I actually see a bunch of messages like these praising it as the best version ever. So UT3's version had a clear front ground delineation that made gameplay spaces defined and readable. High levels of detail were well organized instead of distracting. And the balance of light, color, and shape left the map understandable even in the heat of combat. The oral and visual aspects of UT3's facing worlds embraced all of the concepts of negative space design. As a designer, your job is to focus on subtracting the obvious and only adding the meaningful. I could never say definitively which version of Face was the best, but I feel very confident in saying that with the UT3 version, we were finally able to bring the essence of that original map forward in a meaningful way, and that we had the forethought to capture those aspects of negative space design that helped make the original map such a success. As an industry, we're often just kind of stumbling ahead, and there's this arms race to continually improve graphics and raise visual fidelity, and all too often, this simply means we're adding more stuff to our games. Open vistas have suddenly given way to these dense forests filled with foliage. Clear pathways have been replaced with these kind of techno-paneled and pipe-filled corridors, with every bolt and every blade of grass rendered in startling detail. But do those details actually add to the gameplay experience? Or can they actually be detracting from the quality and enjoyability of our games? We didn't intend for the new versions of Face to be less popular. We didn't just randomly throw a map together. But we didn't think specifically about negative space. We didn't account for the way that the brain takes in information. We didn't distill our presentation to look at contrast or analyze the complexity of information being presented. Good design is about removing, not adding. And negative space is a very valuable tool in our design arsenal, certainly one that we tend to overlook. So, in the future, don't forget to look at what's not there. It can be so much more important than what actually is. Thank you. Looks like we have about 10 minutes if anybody has questions. I don't know if anybody does, or you just want to run off.
Hello.
Hey, go ahead.
Hey, it's on. I 1,000% agree with everything you said. Where I work, our bread and butter is multiplayer maps.
Right on.
There's, I think, 2 additional points that could be made. One is keeping simplicity means that the call-outs are that much more important.
Mm-hmm.
If you have detail everywhere, then you just don't know what to call out in the heat of battle. Where are you? I'm in the blue room. I'm in the red room. I'm in whatever.
Yep, absolutely.
And the other one is effects. That's one of my pet peeves sometimes is when you have effects of papers blowing on the ground or sand going across the ground. In that split second, is it an enemy? Is it a threat? Or is it just pretty?
And that was a huge version, a huge problem with that
effects.
original Egyptian version of Face. Like, there was these pools of water on the ground that you would stumble in, and then it would splash, and you couldn't get out, and you're trying to swim, and dust blowing and obscuring the grass. And, it just absolutely can be a big mess.
And I totally agree, and I am an artist, by the way, so I still agree 100% about it.
Awesome, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I also spent a lot of time as an artist. My question is, have you spent any time figuring out how to create a rule set for this that could be applied to procedural generation of levels?
That is an area that we're just starting to get into at Epic. We are kind of transitioning away from traditional level design in terms of building blocks and pieces and leading more into procedural stuff. Sadly, I can't really talk about that yet. But I can say that in the past, we it's not like we walked around the office saying, you need better negative design in your maps. But we do actually use those terms. We do talk about the way that shapes are organized. We do talk about contrast and balance and all those things. And like I said, we did have that squint tool that we used. So we do use those terms just in our day-to-day work. And how we've carried those forward into new design techniques, maybe I'll be able to talk about next year.
Yeah, you touched on the fact that in I think it was Black Ops, I forget which Call of Duty game it was. You said Favela, and the single player was one of the most popular maps, and in multiplayer, it was the least popular, or one of the least popular. Do you have some insight on maybe why that might be? Like, what kind of?
I mean, that was the whole point. Like, I can't say definitively. I don't have their analytics, but I would guess that it was so overwhelming that it was much more difficult to play, that there was enemies coming from everywhere. You couldn't pick them out. You didn't know which paths you should take. There was multiple options. It was just like every single bit of it was visually, orally, mentally stimulating, overstimulating, and I think a lot of people just gave up out of sheer confusion. That would be my guess. And based on the guys that I've talked to from that team, they kind of indicated that that was the case. Awesome. All right, thank you guys for your time and attention. Appreciate it.